The arrow enters his shoulder at Shalashabrol on a warm March evening in 1199, and with it, an empire begins to bleed. Richard the Lionheart, the warrior king who has survived the Third Crusade, imprisonment in Austria, and countless battles across 2 continents, will die 11 days later from an infected wound delivered by a crossbowman defending a minor castle over a dispute about buried treasure. You can almost hear the collective intake of breath across Christendom when the news spreads. The greatest warrior of his age, brought down not in glorious combat with Saladin, but by a man whose name most chronicles don't even bother to record, defending a fortification that wouldn't rate a footnote in most histories. This is how empires change hands. Not with thundering cavalry charges or elaborate ceremonies, but with chance, with infection, with the trajectory of a single bolt loosed from castle walls at dusk. But to understand why that arrow matters, why that moment sends shockwaves that will still be reverberating a century and a half later when English and French armies face each other at Crécy, you need to go back. Back to when this family wasn't even called Plantagenet. Back to a count from Anjou who wore a sprig of yellow broom flower in his cap, the Plantagenista that would give his descendants their name, though they rarely used it themselves. Back to Geoffrey of Anjou, who married an empress and fathered a king who would rule an empire stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. The year is 1120, and the political landscape of northwestern Europe is about to fracture in the cold waters of the English Channel. Henry I of England, William the Conqueror's son, has finally secured his succession. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, is 17 years old, recently married, and returning to England after paying homage to the French king. The White Ship, the fastest vessel in the fleet, newly fitted and gleaming, sets sail from Barflow on the evening of November 25th. The crew is drunk. The young nobles aboard are drunk. The captain assures everyone that speed and skill will more than compensate. Historian William of Malmesbury, writing within living memory of the event, describes what happens next with unusual restraint. The ship strikes a rock barely out of the harbor. The vessel, moving at full speed, tears open. 300 souls, including the king's son and heir, along with 2 of his illegitimate children and most of the young nobility of England, sink into the black water. Only one person survives, a butcher from Rouen who clings to the mast through the freezing night. When Henry I learns of his son's death, according to chronicler Orderic Vitalis, he never smiles again. More importantly, he never produces another legitimate male heir. His daughter Matilda, widow of the Holy Roman Emperor, becomes his designated successor. But medieval England isn't ready for a queen regnant. The barons aren't ready. Her cousin Stephen of Blois certainly isn't ready to accept her claim. And so England descends into 19 years of civil war that chroniclers will remember as the Anarchy, a time when, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle puts it, Christ and his saints slept. Matilda is formidable. Raised as an empress, married at 8 to a man 30 years her senior, she's been crowned and anointed, has witnessed the machinery of imperial power from the inside. When her first husband dies, her father brings her home and marries her to Geoffrey of Anjou, 14 years her junior, a match she apparently despises. The marriage is political calculation made flesh. Anjou and Normandy have been enemies for generations. Henry I hopes this union will secure his borders. Instead, it creates a family that will redefine what royal power means. Their son, born in 1133, is named Henry. By the time he's 2 years old, his grandfather is dead and England is tearing itself apart. Stephen has taken the throne. Matilda lands with an army. Castles spring up across the countryside like mushrooms after rain, over 1,000 unauthorized fortifications according to some estimates, each one a local tyrant's power base. The rule of law fractures into 1,000 pieces. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's entry for 1137 is one of the most chilling passages in medieval literature. Every powerful man made his castles and held them against the king, and they filled the country full of castles. They greatly oppressed the wretched people by making them work at these castles, and when the castles were made they filled them with devils and evil men. Then they took those whom they suspected to have any goods, by night and by day, seizing both men and women, and they put them in prison for their gold and silver, and tortured them with pains unspeakable. Young Henry grows up in this world, shuttled between Anjou and Normandy, receiving an education that's extraordinary even by royal standards. He learns to read and write in Latin, speaks French as his native tongue, understands English, and will later learn enough Arabic and other languages to surprise foreign ambassadors. Gerald of Wales, who knows him personally, describes a mind that never stops moving, a man who sits down only to eat or ride, who drives his courtiers to exhaustion trying to keep pace with him. He inherits his mother's intelligence and ferocious will, his father's military capability, and from his grandfather, an understanding of administrative power that will transform medieval governance. At 14, he's leading troops in England. At 16, he's knighted. At 18, in a move that stuns contemporary observers, he marries Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's 11 years older than him, recently divorced from Louis VII of France, and she brings as her dowry nearly a third of modern France. Historian Amy Kelly notes that this marriage creates the largest political entity in Western Europe outside of the Holy Roman Empire. It also creates a romantic and political partnership that will produce 8 children and enough drama to fuel centuries of legend. Eleanor isn't just wealthy, she's culturally formidable, a patron of troubadours, raised in the sophisticated courts of southern France where women exercise power more openly than in the north. She's also just returned from the Second Crusade, where her relationship with her first husband, the pious and militarily incompetent Louis VII, finally collapsed. The rumor mill works overtime. Did she have an affair with her uncle Raymond of Ange? The chroniclers love to insinuate. What's certain is that when she looks at young Henry Plantagenet, she sees someone who matches her energy, her ambition, her refusal to be confined by convention. 2 years later, in 1154, Stephen of Blois dies, and Henry II is crowned King of England at 21 years old. The speed of his consolidation is breathtaking. Within months, he's ordering the destruction of unlicensed castles. Within a year, he's reforming the justice system, creating mechanisms that will evolve into common law. He's not just restoring order, he's building something new. Historian John Gillingham argues that Henry II essentially invents the concept of the Angevin Empire, a political structure that defies easy categorization. It's not quite a unified state in the modern sense. It's a collection of territories held by different titles, governed by different customs, but administered with increasing sophistication by a king who seems to be everywhere at once. You need to understand the scale of what Henry rules. From Northumberland to the Pyrenees, from the Irish Sea to the Mediterranean coast. He holds England by conquest and inheritance. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine are his patrimonial lands. Aquitaine comes through Eleanor. He'll add Brittany through his son's marriage. He launches an invasion of Ireland that begins English involvement there, a connection that will echo through 8 centuries. His suzerain to the King of Scotland. He exerts influence over Wales. And crucially, for all of this vast territory, he's technically a vassal of the French king for his continental holdings, a jurisdictional nightmare that will poison Anglo-French relations for generations. The administration he builds is revolutionary. The exchequer, that peculiar institution where accounts are calculated on a checkered cloth, becomes the beating heart of royal finance. Itinerant justices begin traveling regular circuits, bringing royal law to the localities. The Assize of Clarendon in 1166 creates the grand jury system. Property disputes shift from trial by combat to more rational procedures. It's not democracy, not even close, but it's the beginning of the idea that law might be something more than the will of whoever holds the sword. But Henry's reign is also marked by spectacular failures, and the most famous is personal. Thomas Becket, his chancellor, his friend, the man he appoints as Archbishop of Canterbury expecting loyalty, transforms the moment he receives ecclesiastical office. Suddenly, the sophisticated administrator who shared Henry's vision becomes the unbending defender of church privileges. The conflict escalates over years. Who has jurisdiction over criminal clergy? Can the church be taxed? Where does royal authority end and spiritual authority begin? These aren't abstract questions. They're about power, about revenue, about whether a king truly rules his kingdom. The confrontation reaches its crisis on December 29, 1170, in Canterbury Cathedral. For knights, hearing Henry's frustrated outburst about his troublesome archbishop, ride to Canterbury and kill Becket before the altar. The sources differ on Henry's exact words. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" is the Victorian sanitization. The contemporary accounts are rawer, more violent in their language. What's certain is that Henry never ordered the murder directly, but his rage created the conditions that made it possible. Edward Grimm, an eyewitness, describes Becket's skull being shattered, his brain scattered across the cathedral floor. The symbolism is perfect and terrible. Royal power, in its frustration, has literally spilled sacred blood on sacred ground. The backlash is immediate and comprehensive. Becket's tomb becomes a pilgrimage site before his body is cold. Miracles are reported within days. Henry is forced into public penance, walking barefoot to Canterbury, allowing himself to be whipped by monks. He'll fight a rebellion by his own sons, backed by Eleanor and by Louis VII of France, who sees an opportunity to shatter the Angevin Empire. Young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey all take up arms against their father. For a moment, it seems the empire might tear itself apart from within. But Henry survives. He always survives. He crushes the rebellion through a combination of military skill, strategic brilliance, and the simple fact that he's still the most capable ruler of his generation. Eleanor is captured and will spend the next 16 years in comfortable but definite imprisonment. The sons are brought to heel, at least temporarily. Young Henry receives a generous allowance but no real power. Richard gets Aquitaine to govern, where his military talents and his mother's inheritance combine to create a formidable regional power base. Geoffrey receives Brittany through marriage. John, the youngest, born so late that there's nothing left to give him, receives the nickname Lacklando and his father's particular affection, which will prove a poisoned gift. The family dynamics are Shakespearean before Shakespeare writes them. Henry II loves John most, perhaps because John never rebelled, or perhaps because he's the youngest, or perhaps because he reminds Henry of himself at that age, hungry and calculating. But this favoritism breeds resentment in the older brothers, particularly Richard, who sees himself as the natural heir, the warrior, the one who actually wins battles. Young Henry, the crowned heir who has been ceremonially kingless since childhood, grows bitter with waiting. In 1183, he rebels again, this time alongside Geoffrey, against Richard in Aquitaine. The father backs Richard. Young Henry, diseased and desperate, dies of dysentery while plundering monasteries to pay his mercenaries. He's 28. According to chronicler Roger of Howden, his last words are an apology to his father, a request that his debts be paid, and a plea that his followers be treated with mercy. Henry II, hearing of his heir's death, is devastated. The son he named after himself, the boy he crowned king during his own lifetime to secure the succession, is gone. 2 years later, Geoffrey dies in a tournament accident in Paris. He's trampled by horses during a melee, dying at 38, leaving behind a pregnant wife who will give birth to Arthur of Brittany, a boy whose very existence will one day threaten the entire succession. Now there are two sons left: Richard, the warrior; John, the favorite. The stage is set for a tragedy that will unfold over decades. Richard and John, understand, are not simple characters. They're not hero and villain, though centuries of legend and Disney adaptations have tried to make them so. Richard, who will be remembered as Lionheart, Cœur de Lion, the Crusader King, is also a man of sophisticated cultural tastes, a composer of poetry, fluent in at least 3 languages, administratively competent when he chooses to be. He's also capable of extraordinary cruelty. At Acre during the Third Crusade, he will order the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners when ransom negotiations fail, having them marched out of the city and butchered in full view of Saladin's army. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers like Ibn al-Athi record this massacre with horrified detail, describing how the bodies were cut open in search of swallowed gold. John is more complex still. The traditional narrative paints him as incompetent, treacherous, the villain of Robin Hood tales. But historian Ralph Turner argues for a more nuanced view. John is actually highly literate by royal standards, interested in administration and law, personally courageous in battle when circumstances demand it. His problem isn't incompetence. It's that he lacks the one quality medieval kingship absolutely requires, the ability to inspire loyalty. Where Richard commands through charisma and martial prowess, John tries to rule through suspicion and manipulation. Where Richard's cruelties can be excused as the necessities of war, John's seem petty and vindictive. He's not stupid. He's just politically tone-deaf in ways that will prove catastrophic. In 1189, Henry II is dying. Not from violence this time, but from exhaustion, from the accumulated stress of holding an impossible empire together. Richard has allied with Philip Augustus of France against him. The list of nobles who have sworn to Richard is read aloud to the dying king. The last name on the list is John. Even his beloved youngest son has betrayed him. Henry dies at Kynon Castle on July 6, 1189, with only a handful of servants in attendance. According to Gerald of Wales, among the few present at his death, Henry's last words are a curse on all his sons. Richard becomes king at 31, and within months, is planning his crusade. Jerusalem has fallen to Saladin in 1187, a catastrophe that sends shockwaves through Christian Europe. The Third Crusade is meant to reclaim the Holy City, and Richard throws the entire weight of his new kingdom behind the effort. He's not particularly pious by the standards of his time. He's certainly not fighting for faith alone. But he understands that crusading is what kings do to prove their worth, to achieve glory, to write their names in the chronicles of eternity. The financial preparation is staggering. He sells offices, rights, privileges. He allegedly jokes that he would sell London if he could find a buyer. The Saladin tithe, a 10% tax on movable property throughout his domains, raises enormous sums. England is essentially stripped to fund this adventure. The crusade itself is a military masterpiece and a strategic failure. Richard's achievement at Arsuf in September 1191, where his disciplined cavalry charge shatters Saladin's army, is studied in military academies centuries later. His fortification of Chateau Galad in Normandy, designed personally and built with revolutionary castle architecture, represents the cutting edge of medieval military engineering. But he never retakes Jerusalem. He gets within 12 miles of the city before his advisors convince him that even if they capture it, they cannot hold it. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem is a coastal strip, its hinterland controlled by Muslim powers. Richard negotiates a treaty with Saladin allowing Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, then begins the journey home. And this is where the empire's weakness reveals itself. Richard is captured in Austria by Duke Leopold, whom he has offended during the crusade. Leopold hands him over to Emperor Henry VI, who demands a ransom of 150,000 marks, a staggering sum equivalent to twice England's annual revenue. Eleanor, now released from her captivity and acting as regent, somehow raises it. Churches are stripped of their silver. Every taxpayer in England contributes. The Cistercian monasteries give their wool for a year. In February 1194, Richard is released, having spent 15 months in captivity while John tries unsuccessfully to seize power and Philip Augustus devours Richard's continental territories. Richard spends the last 5 years of his life in near-constant warfare, trying to recover what was lost during his crusade and captivity. He's in his element. He wins at Freteville in 1194, a complete victory that restores much of his prestige. He builds Chateau Galad on the Seine, a castle so powerful that he boasts it could hold out for a year even if its walls were made of butter. He's 41 years old, at the height of his powers, when that crossbow bolt finds him at Chalais-Chabrol. The wound isn't immediately fatal. Richard, with characteristic bravado, applauds the bowman's skill. Some sources claim he orders the man brought before him, pardons him, and gives him money. Other sources claim the man is flayed alive after Richard's death on John's orders. The truth is lost in the contradictions of chronicle and legend. What's certain is that the wound becomes infected, gangrene sets in, and 11 days later Richard is dead. He leaves no legitimate children. The succession is disputed between John and Arthur of Brittany, Geoffrey's posthumous son, who is 12 years old and has the support of substantial portions of the Angevin territories. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now 77 years old, performs one final service for her dynasty. She personally travels across Aquitaine securing oaths of loyalty to John. She crosses the Pyrenees in winter to fetch her granddaughter Blanche of Castile for marriage to Louis, Philip Augustus's son, a match designed to secure peace. She's defending an empire she helped create, even though she must know that John is perhaps the worst possible choice to lead it. By the time she dies in 1204 at the Abbey of Fontevraud, where she will be buried alongside Henry II and Richard, the Angevin Empire is already beginning its terminal decline. John loses Normandy in 1204, a military disaster compounded by political isolation. Philip Augustus exploits every weakness. The French king invites John to his court to answer charges brought by the Lusignan family. When John refuses, Philip declares his continental fiefs forfeit. It's legally defensible under feudal law, but it's also a calculated power play. Philip's armies sweep through Normandy. John, who had been in England attending to other crises, returns too late. Chateau Galad, Richard's impregnable fortress, falls after a 6-month siege. Historian John Gillingham notes that the Castellan, Roger de Lacy, holds out heroically, but is undersupplied and unsupported. The garrison is starving. When the castle finally falls, it's not through assault but through a clever infiltration via the latrines, a detail that somehow makes the loss even more humiliating. Within 2 years, John has lost Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and most of Aquitaine. The Angevin Empire, that vast continental holding that stretched from the Channel to the Mediterranean, is reduced to a few coastal strongholds and Gascony. English kings will claim Normandy and other French territories for centuries, but the practical reality is that they're gone. The loss reshapes English identity. The Norman aristocracy that has ruled England since 1066 suddenly has to choose. Are they Norman or English? Most of the great families have estates on both sides of the Channel. Philip Augustus forces the choice by confiscating the Norman lands of anyone who stays loyal to John. Gradually, reluctantly, the Anglo-Norman aristocracy becomes simply English. John's attempt to recover his continental inheritance through alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV and the Count of Flanders ends in disaster at Bouvines in July 1214. Philip Augustus destroys the coalition in a single afternoon of fighting. John isn't even there. He's conducting a separate campaign in Poitou that achieves nothing. The defeat is total. John returns to England having accomplished nothing except the expenditure of enormous sums and the further erosion of baronial trust. The barons have had enough. For years, John has been squeezing them for money, challenging their privileges, threatening their inheritances. He's within his legal rights by the standards of feudal law, but he exercises those rights without the political skill to make them palatable. He demands massive scutage payments, fees paid in lieu of military service. He manipulates inheritance customs, forcing widows to remarry men of his choosing or pay enormous sums to remain unmarried. He takes hostages from baronial families as security for their loyalty. Most damaging of all, he's simply untrustworthy. Agreements made one day are repudiated the next. Promises given are broken when convenient. In an age where a king's word is supposed to be sacred, where personal honor underpins the entire feudal system, John's duplicity is corrosive. In January 1215, a group of barons presents demands to John at London. He stalls. By spring, they've raised an army. In May, they take London, not through assault but because the city opens its gates to them. This is crucial. London, the economic heart of the kingdom, has sided against the king. John has no choice but to negotiate. On June 15, 1215, in a meadow called Runnymede beside the Thames, John sets his seal to a document that will become known as Magna Carta. You need to understand what Magna Carta actually is, not what centuries of mythology have made it. It's not a declaration of human rights. It's not a blueprint for democracy. It's a feudal peace treaty designed to address specific baronial grievances against a specific king. Clause after clause deals with technical issues of medieval law, relief payments, wardship rights, forest law, the jurisdiction of royal justices. But embedded within this technical document are principles that will echo far beyond their immediate context. Clause 39 states that no free man shall be imprisoned or dispossessed except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Clause 40 declares that the king cannot sell, deny, or delay justice. These aren't revolutionary statements in 1215. They're assertions of what's supposed to be normal, complaints that John has violated customary practice. But the act of writing them down, of forcing a king to acknowledge limits to his power, creates something new. The document is also a fantasy. Within weeks, John has appealed to Pope Innocent III, who declares Magna Carta null and void on the grounds that it was extracted under duress. John has no intention of honoring it. The barons know this. By autumn, England is in full civil war. The barons invite Prince Louis of France, Philip Augustus's son, to take the English throne. A French army lands in Kent. For a moment, the Plantagenet hold on England itself seems in doubt. The kingdom that William the Conqueror secured in 1066, that Henry II consolidated, that Richard held through crusade and captivity, might simply cease to exist. And then John dies. Not in battle, not assassinated, but from dysentery contracted, according to some sources, after eating too many peaches and drinking too much cider. It's October 1216. He's 49 years old. His death removes the one thing holding the rebellion together, hatred of John himself. His son, Henry, is 9 years old. A child king evokes sympathy where John evoked contempt. The Regency Council, led by William Marshal, one of the greatest knights of the age, reissues Magna Carta with modifications. The papal legate absolves those who swore fealty to Louis and calls on them to return to their rightful allegiance. Louis's support crumbles. By September 1217, he's agreed to leave England in exchange for payment. The Civil War is over. Henry III reigns for 56 years, one of the longest reigns in English history, and it's a study in the gap between longevity and effectiveness. He's pious, cultured, a patron of architecture who will rebuild Westminster Abbey in the Gothic style, creating one of medieval Europe's architectural masterpieces. He's also politically inept, unable to read the mood of his barons, incapable of the ruthless pragmatism that kingship requires. He surrounds himself with foreign favorites, particularly his wife's relatives from Savoy and later his half-brothers from Provence. He launches expensive and futile campaigns to recover the lost continental territories. He spends lavishly on his own projects while crying poverty when asked to respect baronial rights. The baronial opposition that forms against him is led by Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, who is also Henry's brother-in-law. Simon is a fascinating figure, a younger son of a French nobleman who carved out a position in England through ability and royal favour, married Henry's sister Eleanor, and then gradually became the voice of baronial opposition. Historian John Madicott argues that Simon is motivated by genuine principle, by a belief that the king must govern according to law and counsel. Others suggest he's simply ambitious, using reform as a vehicle for personal power. The truth is probably both. Medieval politics rarely offers pure motives. The conflict escalates through the 1250s and early 1260s. Henry agrees to reforms, then repudiates them. He appeals to the Pope, who releases him from his oaths. The barons take up arms. At Lewes in May 1264, Simon's forces defeat and capture the king and his son Edward. For 15 months, Simon de Montfort effectively rules England in the king's name. He summons a parliament in January 1265 that includes not just barons and bishops but also representatives from each shire and from selected boroughs. This is the innovation that historians fixate on. It's not democracy, the representatives are summoned to approve decisions already made, not to debate policy, but it establishes a precedent that will slowly, over centuries, evolve into parliamentary government. But Simon has made a critical miscalculation. Prince Edward, Henry's eldest son, escapes captivity in May 1265. Edward is 26 years old, tall, athletic, and unlike his father, a military natural. He raises an army with terrifying speed. On August 4, 1265, at Evesham in Worcestershire, Edward's forces trapped Simon's smaller army in a loop of the River Avon. There's no possibility of retreat, no chance for negotiation. What follows isn't a battle, it's an execution. Roger of Wendover's chronicle describes the fighting as unusually vicious even by medieval standards. Simon is cut down, his body mutilated after death. His head is sent to the wife of one of Edward's supporters as a gift. His hands, feet, and genitals are severed and displayed. 18 bannered knights, men whose noble status should protect them from this kind of treatment, die alongside him. It's a massacre designed to send a message: rebellion against the crown will be met with total destruction. Edward becomes king in 1272, and with him, the Plantagenet Dynasty enters its most formidable phase. Edward I is everything his father wasn't: decisive, militarily brilliant, administratively ruthless, politically sophisticated. He's 6'2" in an age when the average man stands 5'7". Contemporary sources describe him with a mixture of awe and fear. He has a temper capable of explosive rage that sends courtiers fleeing. He also has his father's piety and his grandfather Henry II administrative genius. He will spend his reign trying to create a unified British Isles under English dominance, and he will nearly succeed. Wales falls first. The Welsh princes have maintained a precarious independence, sometimes acknowledging English overlordship, sometimes rebelling, always maintaining their own language, laws, and culture. Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, Prince of Wales, has used the chaos of Henry III's reign to expand his power. He styles himself Prince of Wales with papal approval. He refuses to pay homage to Edward. In 1277, Edward invades with overwhelming force, not just armies but engineers, supply lines, a logistical apparatus that allows him to sustain military pressure indefinitely. Llywelyn submits. The terms are harsh but not impossible. For a while, there's peace. Then in 1282, Llywelyn's brother Dafydd launches a rebellion and Llywelyn joins him. Edward's response is annihilation. His armies invade from multiple directions. A fleet supports the land campaign. Llywelyn is killed in a skirmish at Orwyn Bridge in December, his head sent to London and displayed at the Tower. Dafydd is captured the following year, tried for treason, and executed with a brutality designed to horrify, hanged, drawn, and quartered, the first person of noble rank to receive this punishment, which will become the standard for traitors. Edward doesn't just conquer Wales, he fortifies it. Carnarvon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, these massive stone fortresses, built by the greatest castle architect of the age, Master James of St. George, are instruments of occupation. They're not just military structures, they're statements in stone that English power is permanent. The Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 formally annexes Wales, replacing Welsh law with English administration. Welsh independence, which has survived since Roman times, is extinguished. Scotland is different. Scotland is a kingdom, recognised as such by every power in Christendom, with its own ancient royal line. When that line fails with the death of Margaret, Maid of Norway, in 1290, Edward sees opportunity. He's invited to arbitrate between competing claimants to the Scottish throne. He chooses John Balliol, a man with a strong legal claim but weak political support. Edward treats him as a vassal, summoning him to English courts, demanding Scottish military service for English wars. The Scots, who thought they were getting a king, discover they have a governor serving English interests. In 1295, the Scots make an alliance with France, the beginning of what will be called the Old Alliance. Edward's response is immediate: invasion. The campaign of 1296 is brutal even by Edward's standards. Berwick, Scotland's wealthiest town, is sacked with systematic thoroughness. Contemporary sources claim 7,000 inhabitants are killed in a single day, though modern historians suspect the number is inflated. What's certain is that Edward means to terrify Scotland into submission. At Dunbar, the Scottish army is routed. John Balliol is captured, ritually humiliated by having the royal arms stripped from his surcoat, and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Edward seizes the Stone of Scone, the ancient symbol of Scottish kingship, and has it installed in Westminster Abbey beneath the English coronation throne. Scotland, Edward believes, is conquered. But Scotland produces William Wallace, a minor noble whose military genius and charisma create a resistance movement that shocks English power. At Stirling Bridge in September 1297, Wallace's army destroys an English force by allowing half of it to cross the narrow bridge, then attacking before the rest can support them. The Earl of Surrey, commanding the English army, watches his vanguard butchered while the rest of his troops stand helpless on the wrong side of the Forth. It's a tactical masterpiece that exploits terrain and timing perfectly. Wallace is made Guardian of Scotland and launches raids into northern England of such ferocity that the chronicler Walter of Gisborough describes entire regions as depopulated. Edward returns from campaigning in Flanders and takes personal command. At Falkirk in July 1298, English longbowmen destroy the Scottish schiltrons, those dense formations of spearmen that work so well against cavalry but are helpless against missile fire. Wallace escapes, but his military reputation is shattered. He resigns as Guardian and eventually flees Scotland. For 7 years he's a fugitive, until Scottish nobles, perhaps tired of war, perhaps genuinely believing cooperation with England is possible, betray him. He's captured near Glasgow in August 1305, taken to London, and tried for treason. His defense is simple and unanswerable: he never swore allegiance to Edward, so he cannot be a traitor. It makes no difference. He's hanged, drawn, and quartered at Smithfield. His head joins Llewellyn's on London Bridge. His limbs are sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth as warnings. 1 year later, Robert Bruce murders his rival John Comyn in a church in Dumfries and has himself crowned King of Scots. The symbolism is perfect. Bruce, who has shifted allegiances multiple times during the wars, who has sworn fealty to Edward more than once, commits sacrilege and regicide simultaneously, then claims the crown. There's no going back from this. Edward, now 67 years old and in failing health, raises another army. But in July 1307, while marching north, he dies at Borough by Sands, within sight of the Scottish border. His last words, according to some chroniclers, are instructions that his bones be carried at the head of every army that invades Scotland, and that his heart be taken to the Holy Land. His son ignores both requests. Edward II is perhaps the most tragic of the Plantagenets, a man fundamentally unsuited to medieval kingship who is nevertheless trapped by birth into a role he cannot perform. His athletic, capable of physical labor, interested in rural pursuits that his contemporaries find undignified for a king. He forms intense emotional attachments to male favorites, first Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, relationships that may or may not be sexual. The sources are deliberately vague, but are certainly politically disastrous. Gaveston is a Gascon knight of minor nobility whom Edward II showers with titles, estates, and affection that the English barons find intolerable. He's arrogant, witty in ways that humiliate the nobility, and completely dependent on royal favor for his power. The barons force Edward to exile Gaveston multiple times. Each time, Edward brings him back. Finally, in 1312, a group of barons led by the Earl of Lancaster captures Gaveston and executes him without trial on Blacklow Hill. They stab him and then behead him, leaving his body beside the road. Edward never forgives them. The kingdom fractures into factions, royalists loyal to Edward, baronial opposition led by Lancaster, and a shifting middle ground trying desperately to prevent civil war. Meanwhile, in Scotland, Robert Bruce is systematically reclaiming his kingdom. English garrisons fall one by one. Castles that Edward I spent fortunes fortifying are taken through cunning night raids or surrendered when their supplies run out. By 1314, only Stirling Castle remains in English hands, and it's under siege. The garrison commander makes a chivalric agreement with Bruce: if not relieved by midsummer, he'll surrender. Edward II has no choice. To abandon Stirling would be to admit Scotland is lost. He raises the largest English army since his father's day, perhaps 20,000 men, and marches north. Bruce, with maybe 7,000 troops, chooses his ground carefully: Bannockburn, where marshland protects his flanks and the English cavalry advantage is neutralized. The battle unfolds over 2 days in late June. On the first day, English cavalry probes the Scottish position and is repulsed, with one knight, Henry de Bohun, killed in single combat by Bruce himself, a morale boost for the Scots worth 1,000 men. That night, the English army camps in cramped, marshy ground. In the morning, Bruce attacks. His schiltrons advance in echelon, a disciplined wall of spears that forces the English to fight in constricted space where their superior numbers become a liability. The English archers, who could devastate the Scottish formations, are driven off by a small force of Scottish light cavalry. The English cavalry cannot charge effectively through the marsh. Infantry cannot deploy properly. The whole massive army compresses into killing ground where Scottish spears methodically destroy formation after formation. Edward II flees the field while the battle still rages, a decision that destroys what remains of his military reputation. The English army collapses into rout. Hundreds drown trying to cross the Bannockburn. Thousands more are cut down in pursuit. The Earl of Gloucester dies in the fighting. Dozens of Bannock knights are captured and held for ransom. It's the most complete Scottish military victory in centuries, and it secures Bruce's throne. England will fight on for years, but Scotland's independence is effectively assured. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328 will finally recognise Robert I as King of Scots, with England renouncing all claims to overlordship. But Edward II never sees that treaty. His reign spirals into disaster through the 1320s. Hugh Despencer, his new favourite, and Hugh's father accumulate power and wealth with Edward's backing. The Queen, Isabella of France, is sidelined and humiliated. She travels to France in 1325 and refuses to return, instead taking Roger Mortimer, an exiled baron, as her lover and co-conspirator. In September 1326, they invade England with a small force. The kingdom, exhausted by Edward's misrule, offers almost no resistance. The Despensers are captured and executed with elaborate cruelty. Edward II is forced to abdicate in favour of his 14-year-old son. In September 1327, Edward II dies at Berkeley Castle under circumstances that remain deliberately obscure. The official story is natural causes. Persistent rumours suggest murder, possibly involving a red-hot poker, though this may be propaganda. What's certain is that Isabella and Mortimer cannot allow him to live. A deposed king is always a rallying point for rebellion. Edward III is crowned at 14, but for 3 years, England is ruled by his mother and Mortimer. In October 1330, at 19 years old, Edward stages a coup. He has Mortimer arrested at Nottingham Castle, entering through a secret tunnel with a group of trusted knights. Mortimer is tried by Parliament and executed. Isabella is pensioned off to comfortable retirement. Edward, finally his own master, begins a reign that will last 50 years and transform England into a military power that dominates Western Europe. He's learned from his father's mistakes. Where Edward II alienated his nobility, Edward III makes them partners in glory. He revives the Arthurian ideal, creates the Order of the Garter, makes warfare profitable for those who follow him. He's a gambler by temperament, willing to take enormous risks for potentially enormous rewards. And he has a claim to the French throne that, while legally dubious, provides the justification for the greatest military adventure of the medieval age. The claim comes through his mother, Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France. When Isabella's 3 brothers die without surviving sons between 1316 and 1328, the French throne passes to Philip VI, son of Philip IV younger brother. Edward argues that descent through a daughter should override descent through a younger son. The French invoke Salic law, which supposedly forbids inheritance through the female line, though scholars note this tradition is more invented than ancient. The legal arguments matter less than the reality. France is wealthy, divided, and Edward thinks it's vulnerable. He doesn't invade immediately. He spends a decade building alliances, securing his northern border with Scotland, reforming his military. English armies have traditionally relied on mounted knights supported by infantry. Edward, learning from his grandfather's Welsh campaigns and from Bannockburn, builds a combined arms system around the longbow. An English longbow in trained hands can shoot 12 arrows per minute at effective range of 200 yards, with enough force to penetrate mail armor. Mass longbow volleys can devastate cavalry charges before they make contact. Protected by dismounted men-at-arms and positioned on favorable ground, English armies become nearly unbeatable in defensive battles. The war begins in 1337 with naval skirmishes and raids. In 1340, at Sluis, the English fleet destroys a French force in the harbour, securing English control of the Channel. But the real test comes on August 26, 1346, at a place called Crécy in northern France. Edward's army, perhaps 12,000 strong, has been conducting a chevauchée, a devastating raid through Normandy designed to burn, loot, and humiliate the French king. Philip VI catches up to him with an army at least twice as large, probably more. Edward chooses his ground, a gentle slope, flanks protected by forests and a village, his dismounted men-at-arms in the center with longbowmen on the wings in a formation that would later be called a hearse. The French arrive late in the afternoon, their army strung out from a long march. The sensible thing would be to make camp and fight fresh in the morning. But Philip's knights are eager, angry that the English have been ravaging French territory for weeks. The army deploys in something approaching chaos. Geno's crossbowmen, professional mercenaries, are sent forward to soften the English position. They advance uphill into the late afternoon sun, their strings dampened by a brief rainstorm. The English longbowmen, who have kept their strings dry, unleash volleys that chronicler Jean Froissart, who interviews survivors, describes as falling like snow. The Genos break and retreat. Then comes the moment that defines the battle and, in many ways, defines the entire war. French cavalry, contemptuous of the retreating crossbowmen, ride them down to get at the English. Wave after wave of mounted knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom, charge up that slope into arrow storms that strip men from their saddles before they can close. Horses scream and fall, creating obstacles that trip the following waves. Those who reach the English line find dismounted men-at-arms waiting with pole weapons. The charges continue into the night. Froissart counts 16 major attacks. Each one breaks against the English position. Each one leaves more bodies piled in the trampled ground. Edward III watches from a windmill on the height, refusing to commit his reserves. At one point, his 16-year-old son Edward, the Prince of Wales, is fighting in the thick of combat. A messenger reaches the king saying the prince is hard-pressed and needs support. Edward asks if his son is wounded or unhorsed. Told he is not, Edward responds, "Let the boy win his spurs." It's calculated risk-taking that borders on cruelty, but it works. The prince, who will be known as the Black Prince for the color of his armor, holds his position. By nightfall, French dead carpet the slope. Philip VI has been wounded twice and is pulled from the field by his advisors. The King of Bohemia, John the Blind, who is literally blind and has to be led into battle, dies fighting with his retinue tied to his horse by rope so he can follow them into the melee. His son, the future Charles IV, is among the few French nobles to escape with their reputation intact. The casualties are staggering. Modern estimates suggest 1,500 to 2,000 French dead, including 11 princes, 1,200 knights, and thousands of common soldiers. English losses are perhaps 100 to 300. The disparity isn't just numerical, it's symbolic. The flower of French chivalry has been destroyed by English yeomen. The social implications reverberate. Knights, who justify their privileged position through military function, have been shown to be vulnerable to commoners with bows. The military aristocracy's monopoly on battlefield effectiveness is shattered. Edward doesn't march on Paris. He takes Calais after a year-long siege, securing a permanent English foothold in France, then returns home to celebrate. But Crécy is just the beginning. 10 years later, in 1356, the Black Prince, now commanding his own army, fights another battle at Poitiers that somehow surpasses Crécy in its improbability. Outnumbered by perhaps 3 to 1, the prince's army uses the same tactical system: dismounted men-at-arms supported by archers, defensive position, discipline against French charges. This time, the prize is even greater. King John II of France, Philip's successor, is captured in the fighting. A reigning French king, taken prisoner on French soil by an English army a fraction of the size of his own. The ransom is set at 3 million gold écus, an astronomical sum that will bankrupt France. But between Crécy and Poitiers, something else arrives that dwarfs even these military catastrophes: the Black Death. The plague reaches Europe in 1347, probably on Genoese trading ships fleeing the Mongol siege of Kaffa. By 1348, it's in England. By 1350, it has killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population. Historian Philip Ziegler's research suggests England loses perhaps 40% of its people. Villages are abandoned. Fields go untilled. Labor, which has always been abundant and cheap, suddenly becomes scarce and valuable. The social order that has persisted since the conquest begins to crack. The plague doesn't stop the war, but it transforms it. Armies are smaller because there are fewer men. Campaigns become shorter because logistics are more difficult. The Black Prince's chevauchés through southern France in the 1350s and 1360s are exercises in organized destruction, burning and looting to deny resources to the French. He sacks Limoges in 1370 with such brutality that even Froissart, usually admiring of the prince, describes it with horror. 3,000 inhabitants are killed. The prince, by now suffering from dysentery that will kill him within 6 years, oversees the massacre from a litter, too weak to mount his horse. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 gives Edward III everything he wanted: recognition of his sovereignty over Aquitaine, Calais, and other territories, in exchange for renouncing his claim to the French throne. For a moment, it seems the war is over. But the treaty's implementation provisions are never fulfilled. Within 9 years, the French King Charles V, a physically weak but intellectually formidable ruler, has begun systematically reconquering English holdings. He appoints Bertrand de Guesclin, a Breton knight who understands that French armies cannot beat the English in set-piece battles, as Constable of France. De Guesclin fights a different kind of war, avoiding battle, attacking supply lines, besieging castles when English field armies are elsewhere, gradually bleeding the English presence to death. By 1375, the English hold only Calais, Bordeaux, and Bayonne. The great empire that Edward thought he had won is almost gone. Edward III dies in 1377, senile and stripped of power by his mistress Alice Porus and various court factions. The Black Prince has preceded him in death the year before, destroyed by the disease contracted in Spain. The crown passes to Edward III's grandson, Richard II, who is 10 years old. The dynasty enters another period of minority rule and regency politics. Richard, when he comes of age, proves to be cultured, intelligent, and psychologically fragile. He faces the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, when English commoners, empowered by post-plague labor shortages and enraged by new taxes, march on London demanding the abolition of serfdom. Richard meets them personally at Smithfield, watches the mayor of London kill their leader Wat Tyler, and makes promises he immediately breaks. The revolt is crushed with systematic hangings, but the old order cannot be fully restored. Serfdom begins its slow decline. Labor services are increasingly converted to money rents. The social transformation triggered by the plague accelerates. Richard's reign ends in deposition and probable murder in 1400, overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV. The usurpation creates a legitimacy crisis that will fester for decades. Henry IV's reign is consumed by rebellions, the Percy family in the north, Owen Glendower in Wales, constant threats from Scotland. His son, Henry V, seeks to legitimate the dynasty through military glory, reviving the war with France with spectacular success. Agincourt in 1415 is Crecy all over again. A smaller English army destroys a larger French force through superior tactics and longbow firepower. Henry conquers Normandy systematically, castle by castle, siege by siege. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 makes him heir to the French throne and regent of France. He marries Catherine of Valois, daughter of the mad French King Charles VI. For a moment, it seems the Plantagenet dream of a unified Anglo-French realm might actually be achieved. But Henry V dies in 1422 at 35, probably of dysentery contracted during the Siege of Meaux. His son, Henry VI, is 9 months old. In France, the Dauphin Charles, disinherited by Troyes, maintains his claim from south of the Loire. For 8 years, the English occupation holds. Then in 1429, a peasant girl from Domremy claiming divine inspiration appears at the Dauphin's court. Joan of Arc's military achievements are debated by historians. What's undeniable is her psychological impact. She breaks the siege of Orleans, escorts Charles to Reims for his coronation, transforms French morale from despair to confidence. The English capture her, try her as a heretic, and burn her at the stake in 1431. But the momentum has shifted. Slowly, relentlessly, the French reconquer their kingdom. By 1453, the English hold only Calais. The 100 Years' War, which has consumed resources, lives, and national energies for over a century, is effectively over. England has lost everything it gained and more. The great continental empire is gone. The Plantagenet dynasty itself is disintegrating. Henry VI suffers bouts of catatonic madness, perhaps inherited from his French grandfather. The nobility fractures into factions. In 1455, the Wars of the Roses begin, a civil war between Lancastrian and Yorkist branches of the Plantagenet family that will consume the dynasty in an orgy of executions, battles, and betrayals. The dynasty that began with Geoffrey of Anjou's sprig of yellow broom, that built an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, that produced Henry II administrative genius and Richard's martial glory, that survived Magna Carta and baronial rebellions, that conquered Wales and nearly conquered Scotland and France, finally devours itself in a succession crisis without resolution. Edward IV, Edward V, Richard III, the last Plantagenet kings rule a realm exhausted by war and divided by faction. At Bosworth Field in 1485, Richard III dies in battle, the last English king to do so, and the crown passes to Henry Tudor, whose claim is tenuous but whose victory is absolute. What remains? Magna Carta evolves into constitutional tradition. Parliament, summoned by kings who need money for wars, gradually accumulates power and precedent. Common law, developed under Henry II and refined by his successors, becomes the basis of legal systems across the English-speaking world. The military innovations, the longbow, the chivorci, combined arms tactics, influence European warfare for centuries. The idea that a king is subject to law, that power must be justified and constrained, that subjects have rights that rulers must respect, these concepts forged in the conflicts between Plantagenet kings and their subjects become foundations of modern governance. But there's a darker legacy too. The conquest of Wales and the attempted conquest of Scotland plant seeds of resentment that persist through centuries. The 100 Years' War devastates France and bankrupts England while accomplishing nothing permanent. The Wars of the Roses kill a substantial portion of the English nobility and traumatize a generation. The dynasty's glory is inseparable from its brutality, its achievements from its failures. You stand in Westminster Abbey, looking at the tomb of Edward I and his wife Eleanor of Castile, the finest royal couple monument in England. Nearby is Henry III rebuilt cathedral, Gothic splendor funded by taxes that caused rebellions. Walk to the Tower of London and you're walking where the Stone of Scone sat for 700 years, a symbol of conquest. Visit Canterbury Cathedral and you're standing where Thomas Becket's blood spilled on the stones. The Plantagenets are everywhere in the landscape of Britain and France, in castles and cathedrals, in legal traditions and linguistic inheritances, in the very shape of the nations they ruled and the wars they fought. 3 centuries of one family's hunger for power, expressed through genius and catastrophe, wisdom and madness, glory and shame. This is what empire looks like from the inside, not the triumphant story taught to school children, but the complicated, bloody, human reality of men and women trying to hold together something too vast to control, fighting wars they cannot win, making compromises they cannot keep, and finally succumbing to the mathematics of mortality and the chaos of succession. The yellow broom flower has long since withered. The lions on the banners have faded. But the consequences of those 3 centuries remain, woven into the fabric of the modern world in ways we barely recognize but cannot escape.